That's what strikes me about what you're saying. And we make these comparisons between Ukraine and Taiwan. There's also an element here that the U.S. for a long time was kind of covering most of the NATO security budget, and that was a big point of contention between the U.S. and NATO countries, and they were not taking the threat seriously. In many ways, it sounds like that's what's happening with Taiwan, where the U.S. is investing this time and energy and money into Taiwan, and really at the core, the threat is not being taken seriously.
So I think this is an excellent point. Moral hazard, this idea that if you insure somebody, you're only going to make them more likely to engage in the dangerous behavior. I think that is an acute problem in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. And I think there are several aspects to it, none of which are necessarily super easy to solve, but all of which have to be addressed. On the one hand, I definitely think there's the sense that, listen, the Chinese are never going to really do this. There are brothers, there are kindred spirits, and that's just not the way they operate. Another aspect, I think, of the challenge is this idea that the U.S., and let's be honest, whether we're talking post-World War II or the 1970s, we do have a history of throwing Taiwan under the bus. And so there's this deep skepticism and cynicism, I think, even especially among the older generations, that really U.S. arms sales are a form of protection racket. So as long as we buy U.S. weapons, we can just shove the darn things on a shelf. If they want us to buy Harpoon asymmetric weapons, fine, we'll buy them, we'll shove them on a shelf. Really what we're doing is paying protection money and ensuring that the U.S. will come. I worry a great deal that there's a disconnect because the U.S. sees this as, listen, we're giving you weapons to fight for yourself. That gives you the ability to defend yourself. And so they're expecting us to show up, and we're expecting a Ukraine model where we can just send weapons from afar. That could be a real problematic disconnect. And then on the DPP side, my real fear is that I think there is a sense that, listen, we're going to come in and save the day. And I'll be honest, I doubt that Taiwan could withstand a sustained invasion on its own indefinitely. I don't think any military analyst thinks that they could. So yes, the U.S. would need to show up. My fear is that if the DPP doesn't push for its military to take the threat more seriously, I think there's a sense that we're going to show up in a matter of days, maybe a matter of weeks. But as Matt Pottinger and others made clear in Boiling Moat, we actually think that we're going to be talking Taiwan holding out for maybe months or longer. And that even if the U.S. shows up, this war may escalate in directions we don't anticipate. And so the U.S. may find itself distracted and tied down in other theaters as well. And Taiwan may still need to be able to continue some big bulk of the fighting. And to the degree that the DPP thinks really this war will be short, China's going to mobilize. The U.S. is going to see it. The U.S. is going to show up very quickly, and China's going to be thwarted before any boots get on the deck. Again, my sense is that cognitive mindset, the moment that's dashed, that could be very horrifying for the Taiwanese people, and that's when we should be worried that they just sort of give up.
Well, the CCP's military budget is like upwards of $200 billion a year, right? It's more than the entire national revenue of Taiwan.
Yeah, so their self-admitted budget is $200 billion, but I have seen estimates in the public space, it actually realistically is probably closer to about $700 billion. And yes, if you then compare this to Taiwanese defense spending as recently as 2021, Taiwan was spending about 11 billion US. Just today, they announced they're going to be spending 20 billion US. So, it is a dramatic increase. But if you just look, the Chinese military budget, no matter how you define it, is orders of magnitude larger.
Wow. So the CCP budget could be almost on par with the U.S.
It by some estimates that I've seen, yes, it could be very close to the U.S. And if you just think about the fact that they don't have to pay their soldiers nearly as much as we have to pay ours, they can get a lot more boom for the buck. Now, quality of personnel, quality of equipment, that of course is up to interpretation. But the whole goal here is not to win the war. The goal is to deter Xi from even rolling the dice in the first place.
Right. Now, one of the things you've written a lot about is that Taiwan shouldn't necessarily look to the military model of the United States, but in fact, they might be better off looking at the model of really small countries dealing with really big threats, countries like Estonia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and most importantly, as you pointed out, Israel. So what ought Taiwan learn from that Israel model?
No, it's I'd say it's a terrific observation, but I would be self-congratulating. No, I think this is an important point. If I were a super snarky academic, I guess I would probably write an article about the U.S. military support for Taiwan entitled, like, With Friends Like These. I don't know that the U.S. military has been doing Taiwan that many favors over the years. For many years, we were selling them weapon systems that were just not appropriate for the problem set that they faced, and talking about very expensive high-end platforms like F-16s. Then when we train them, of course, we train them in the model that we understand. That makes sense, but that's just not a model that's going to work for Taiwan. Just to use one example, for several years, the Taiwanese military said, listen, we want to reorganize our reserve force to look like your reserve force. And in fact, if you talk to people in Taipei, they would even say, we want our reservists to be weekend warriors like your reservists. And I was trying to impress on them, weekend warrior is not a good thing. That's not a term of praise. So some things are lost in translation. But the bottom line, and I say this having served 6 years on active duty and 10 years in the reserves, is the U.S. reserve model, the way it operates today, is predicated on the assumption that you have months and months and months of advance warning. You can activate reserve units. These reserve units have already been training 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year, and then you give them 3, 5, 6 months of refresher training before you have to send them downrange. There's just absolutely no world in which any realistic invasion unfolds in which Taiwan will be able to mimic that. So it's just got to find a different way of doing things, preferably one that is organized around a kind of fight tonight mentality. And so Israel is obviously a classic example of a force with a relatively small active duty apparatus, a large but very capable reserve apparatus, and both of those are able to integrate and go downrange to fight in short order and under duress. And we just, unfortunately saw that play out a few months ago. Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, well, Estonia, Lithuania, less Latvia, I think are another great example. These are really small military organizations. They have built in or integrated themselves with large territorial defense forces. So this idea of civilians who are volunteered, they're trained, they're ready to augment what the active duty can do. And for Estonia in particular, so small, there's this recognition that, listen, we can't win on our own. But what we can do is make the prospect for a quick military victory so low that it will both deter Russia, but also buy the U.S. and the rest of the NATO allies to the West plenty of time so that they can actually get in there and protect the Estonian people.